Now that we have covered the adding the point groups that are just related to rotation, now we need to add mirror plane to the to the translation array, the net, and see what kind of new things we can induce this way. So that's what we're going to do next, and it turns out that we not only get some new groups called PM, CM, and PG. We'll explain what G is because it is a two-step operation. So we don't violate what we talked about before, the number of one-step operations. It's just that when we have some operations of convenience, we may recognize them and then define them. So we can define a two-step operation if we want, composed from the unique one-step operations. That's what we're going to do because it's going to turn out to be useful. So let's start with PM, very simple thing. We're gonna simply take our primitive rectangular net, the general net, make it kind of big here. We have defined maybe a T1, and a T2 in a right-handed coordinate system. Okay, so here we are, and what we first do when we add mirror planes is that we add them to the edge of the standard cell. And the reason is, remember, that we've created these nets compatible with these symmetries. And you can see here that since T1 goes this way and T1 goes that way, if we're going to add M, certainly we can add it here because it flips everything over here and it's consistent with the translation points over there. Now there may be other M's around, but at least we know we can add that one. And therefore, of course, it means that, by definition, there's one here too. But let's add the simplest motif that we can and see by inspection in this case what will lead to a new theorem. So let's imagine that we're looking at a motif that is not too high a symmetry but has mirror plane. And you see that's such a motif, and I can say that this is the first one. And if I place that there, it's reflected across M over there, right? Now, of course, what that means, if you just look at the symmetry here, I'm going to have, a set over here. But remember, in this experiment, what we're doing is we take one, reflect it around here, that's M, and then we translate over to this guy here. So remember what we're doing here, in a way, we're doing a flipping operation first, and then we are actually, remember the symbol for M when you're doing the operator, instead of symbolizing it here, it's a sigma. So I'm doing an M, and then I'm doing a translation afterwards, right? So first one, this, then translate. Now, how are 1 and 3 related? They're actually related to a new mirror plane, as you can see right down the middle. If I drew that straight. Oops. M. So there's a new M, and you can see here that relates these two objects here. So when I add M, I end up with a unique, notice that M is unique because it actually is not the same environment as the blue. So the green M and blue M are not the same, and but I automatically get an induced another M, into the lattice structure. So you can already start to see that we're going to have a new. We don't know the generic form yet, but we can see that what I wrote there. If we take one mirror plane with one of the vectors, let's say, it's going to give us obviously another mirror plane, right? And that second mirror plane is going to be at, right? So if we call if we look at this right here, and this t1 direction is t perpendicular, because it's perpendicular to the mirror plane, right? Then at half, right, remember this is half, 1/2 t perpendicular, we end up with this new mirror plane. So we'd be calling this sigma 2 because it's the original one that we put in there. So that's a specific case for a new net, and one I probably develop a more general one in a bit, and we're going to see that, because what we're going to do is we're going to now say, well, if I added this mirror plane to a primitive rectangular net, I obviously can add it to a centered net, centered rectangular net, but do we get a different result? Because remember, even though we think we can add it, it doesn't mean we're going to get the same result. So just remember that this is the simplest mirror addition you can have. So this point group is going to be called PM. And I didn't finish drawing all the lattice points here, but don't forget you have the motifs here and here, right? So that's PM. Notice how it doesn't necessarily mean I have another mirror plane here, right? Because this is related to this through translation, not by mirroring, right? All right, so with that in our hand, let's move on to the centered rectangular one. If I drew that about in the center there. The standard cell is like this. Now remember, in the center net, this guy just goes up here in the next cell, right? So if I'm going to add a mirror plane here, I have to add one in the middle, of course, which you would have to do anyway for the reason I said before, that since you have a point here, everything's got to be symmetric around both. As you can see here, this is going to have to be reflected across there. So these three are essentially the same ones. And just call our terminology, then this is t perpendicular because it's that, and this is t parallel because it's parallel to the mirror planes. Okay? And remember that when we draw motifs now, same ones we did before. There's our first one. It's going to be up here too. Of course, it also has to be here. But let's actually not do that yet. Let's get there by doing what we did before. Let's do number 1. And I have a mirror plane, which is going to create this guy. It's going to create this guy. And then the translation that I'm going to use to do this by saying, all right, let's take this translation up to this corner. Oops, let's actually go back to black. Remember how there's a translation vector related to this central lattice point. So if I make this as 2 and I translate it up, I'm going to end up with something around here. Right, so again you can see how I take that center, the first motif, reflect it with M. So again, following the generic thing about sigma dot T operating on, T operating on sigma, because that T comes up to here and produces this guy. So the question is, what is the relationship between 1 and 3? And we can see that it doesn't look like there is anything that is unique. It's not a one-step operation. But this is going to be one of those odd things where it can be useful to define a new one. Let's make it green. So now we're going to draw a generally dash line for this one. You'll see what it's made up of, because 1 and 3 are the first things we pointed out always when we look at these things. Is you can tell whether mirror is involved by looking at the right hand and this left hand. This is right hand. This is left hand. And since we just translate it, you can see here this is still left hand. So we're going to have a mirror. But if I mirrored it, it would just be over here. And it's actually up. Right? So this operation is sort of like a two-step operation where we say, I have a mirror, and then I have a translation. And notice how to translate it up here, I have a fraction of this translation vector. And the way I've drawn this is a full, T parallel. I call this would have to be T parallel over, 2 or something. But I'll come back and change this in a second for a generic case. So, this mirror followed by translation, we're going to call this G, not for green, even though it is green, but for glide. Right, so it's going to be called the glide plane. Well, it's actually glide line again because we're, in 2D. So let's look at the generic case for that. So again, you can see here the pattern. Oh, by the way, I have to have, let's make this complete before I erase it. There's a mirror plane in the middle, so we have to have this guy, which will be back to right-handed, and so of course the same thing is going to be on this side. So we have another glide plane there. So now you're starting to see the development of CM. But before we make the final, well, let's just make the final drawing of that. And, remember how we label these G, but remember when we do our notation, remember these guys, the M's become sigmas, right? So this will also be a sigma. It's just that in the case of a mirror plane, right, we have affiliated this with a translation vector. where in the case of a glide plane, we're typically going to associate it with some tau. Again, just a generic notation that when I have a normal mirror plane right here, it's just some operation and it's mixed with translation. Where when I'm talking about G, I'm going to have tau, which is some sort of glide thing, which is different from the mirror plane, right? So even though we're going to use the symbol sigma, we're going to use kind of this tau to let us understand that it's a glide plane. And of course, G is what we assign. We do the dashed line thing all to identify glide versus M. Now let's look at a generic case here before we do the final drawing. Well, this is the final drawing. So this, let's just do that. This will be, therefore, CM. And I'm getting pixelated. So let me do the generic case. We can already see we have a theorem coming, because up till now, we've taken a reflection. We've done this, and we've seen that we get another reflection, right? But here, we've done this on a centered rectangular, where everything's not, perpendicular oriented, and we find out that actually we can end up with things like a glide plane, and maybe some mirror planes too, of course, but we can get some glide planes. So let's look in the case when we have a generic T that is not perpendicular to M. Let's imagine that there's some translation point that has a mirror plane in it. Well, it has a translation direction, but it also has passing through it a mirror plane, as we did when we developed both CM and CM and PM. But I just want to develop the generic expression for when the translation vector is not necessarily perpendicular to the glide plane. Sorry, the mirror plane. So we have our right-handed object and our left-handed object. And because this point has a translation associated with it, you know that there will be a lattice that allows you to move this in some direction, some given translation that's allowed in the net that you're operating in. And we're going to break that down into two components. There's the one that is perpendicular, to the plane, or line in this case, and then one that's along it, right? T parallel and T perpendicular. So of course this is right. This means, of course, that that left-hand object is translated up that same amount, falling just short of this guy here. So that would look like this. And so the axes that is forming the glide plane, the line, the plane of that glide is represented here. So now if we put this all together with our notation and the fact that this was the original sigma, the notation we're going to use here is that this is going to be our tau, don't forget, right? And so we're going to say that a generic t, which is t parallel plus t perpendicular, dotted with a, operating on a sigma, the blue sigma, is going to equal that green sigma tau, and tau is equal to t parallel, right? So that's the generic expression relating these things. And so that is Cm, which has, because of this, mirror planes and glide planes, as we showed in the last view graph, so the last slide. So what we're going to do now is just say, fine, I've invented this new two-step operation, which is convenient. Can I apply it conveniently, even though it's not one step? You know, I can apply it, even though it's got two steps buried within it. Can I jump to the task, and instead of discovering that these glide planes are there, if I just throw it into a primitive lattice, will there be something that shows up that I haven't thought of yet? And so that's going to be PG, right? And you can see here, using our theorem at the bottom, we're going to have t parallel plus t perpendicular as t, right, dotted with sigma tau equals sigma prime tau plus t parallel. So let's explain that. That's a completely general version of where we're headed, and the way we see that is the following. So like I said, let's just take a generic lattice again now. And now that we know we have a glide plane, let's add that to the edge. You know, it's compatible with the lattice, so instead of figuring it out in different ways, let's just add that in. So if I had a simple object here, then that has to be through translation related to here, right? So if I'm going to apply this, let's just say, you know, I go over here, right? Because what I have to do is have something compatible with a fraction of t. So here I'm making it half t. So I'm saying, look, this guy's here, right? I'm reflecting, then I'm going up half t, then I reflect again, go up the other half t. And so that's consistent with translation. I don't break anything, right? And, you know, of course, that means that this little jig here is actually my operation, right? My two-step operation. Well, now that I've got this guy in the middle, remember, I still have to have that be able to be translated, right? The motif has to experience t, still be in the lattice. So we're going to get something over here like this. Right. That makes sense because it's the same as what we've just seen there. And all of a sudden you sit there and say, well, that's kind of interesting. Well, first let me draw the other glide plane because it's already there from translation, right? Oh, boy, yeah. Right, this is that same, you know, G that I drew over here, same thing, right? But now, if you look, say, look at what's the relationship between these guys? Well, looks like there's another glide plane in here that again is a different one. It's induced let's call that prime to indicate it's different from the other one, right? And you can see here that's this big one bouncing back and forth versus the little, distance I'm bouncing back and forth over that one. So, if we were to write down what happened here, we would say, all right, I had a sigma tau, and I applied a translation to it. In this case, right, the translation here, the perpendicular part and the parallel part are exactly, they're not at an angle. That induced a nuclide plane at t over 2, where t, as we're defining now, is really, this t. So in our old language, remember t here is t perpendicular, right? Because it's perpendicular, t is perpendicular to these planes. So I had this original sigma tau, and I had a t perpendicular to it. And I found out, at t over 2, there's another one there. Okay? So putting all that together, well, first of all, this is PG. Don't forget that. All we did was add the G to the P and get this this two-step operation to work. Version then. We didn't have just T perpendicular. So it's the same thing we had above here. Same thing. Except that where everything here is in perpendicular, we took our other information that we had. We said, okay, now it's T parallel. We take the information we had from there and inserted it. And really all that happens is the same thing we had just here. It's that you're just shifted, this tau is shifted with this T parallel. And that's it. And as you see here, that's what we had written down here with a little bit. This is a tau, and this is a tau, actually. And that's a new generic version of the new combination theorem. Now, one of the things you could ask is, okay, you added G to PG and got a non-obvious result. So, can we have ACG? Why not? Well, let's do that out a little bit here. It's going to be our original G. We're in the center of lattice, that means we have one here. Draw motifs. That are the translation up to here. Flips there, that flips there. So now if you look at what these G's do, is it induces mirror planes in the middle. You can see that here, etc. Right? So what we've just done is by adding G's, we end up with M's. So this is starting to look like a real crystal structure. There's a couple ways to see that, however, this is nothing new. And if you look carefully back at what we produced, if I shift a quarter of this translation vector now, right here, and I were just to move this as the center, I would have a mirror plane here, and a mirror plane halfway through, and a mirror plane at the edge. So that's when I inserted, a quarter, and then I go up a quarter, so I ended up with exactly the same thing as Cn, right? So remember, if I picture, at least even just let's look at these planes here. If I said let's make this the first point, and I shifted the entire reference lattice by a quarter, and you go back and look, you'll see this is the same thing as a Cn. So it does not produce a unique cell. The other way you can see it is to use our theorem that's shown below. By definition, right? Because the center of the lattice, this is going to be 1/2 T1 plus T2, right? So the X version and the Y version are 1/2 T1 and 1/2 T2, right? And that's the translation that we're intersecting with our tau plane. Remember, that's going to equal sigma tau prime at T perpendicular over 4. If we call this T1, right? So that would be T perpendicular over 4, right? But if we look carefully at what we had said, this tau prime, oops, sorry, wrong one. This tau prime So this full translation down here tells you it's a mirror plane. So either by just looking at this shifting compared to the last thing, or going through the theorem, you can see that CG is not unique and that it just produces CN. So, just to summarize, we have three new point groups, PM, PG, and CN.